I'm Laurie Endicott Thomas, the author of Thin Diabetes, Fat Diabetes, Prevent Type 1, Cure Type 2. In this video, I explain that there's no such thing as a healthy high-fat diet. Low-carbohydrate diets have been popular on and off since the 1860s. One of the pioneers of the low-carbohydrate diets was a man named William Banting. And then, of course, during the 1970s, Robert Atkins promoted the Atkins diet, which was a low-carbohydrate diet. Low-carbohydrate diets are basically diets that have a heavy emphasis on animal source foods, because animal source foods, with the exception of milk, contain no carbohydrates at all. Milk contains a carbohydrate called lactose that many people cannot digest. So if you're eating a low-carbohydrate diet, you're generally eating a diet that's based heavily on animal source foods, although it can also include some low-calorie green and yellow vegetables, and maybe an occasional piece of fruit. In contrast, a high-carbohydrate diet is based heavily on all sorts of plants, including grains and starchy vegetables such as potatoes, as well as vegetables and fruits and beans and peas. Now, the low-carbohydrate diets provide a lot of their calories in the form of fat, and they can provide too much protein. In contrast, the high-carbohydrate diets are low-fat diets that provide a reasonable amount of protein. The real big fat lie that's being spread is the idea that high-carbohydrate diets cause blood sugar problems. In reality, even diabetics need to eat high-carbohydrate diets. Now, scientists have known since the early 1930s that the higher your carbohydrate intake is, the more sensitive you become to the effects of the hormone insulin. In contrast, the more fat you eat, the less sensitive you become to insulin. Yes, there are some essential fats, but they're unhealthy in big doses. We have known since the early 1930s that fatty diets cause insulin resistance, which is the underlying problem in type 2 diabetes. In contrast, starchy diets reverse insulin resistance, which is why starchy diets reverse type 2 diabetes. This graph came from a medical journal article. It shows the results of 2 glucose tolerance tests. One of these tests was done after the test subject had eaten a high-fat diet, which was 80% fat by calorie, for a week. Then he fasted overnight and was given 50 grams of glucose in water on an empty stomach. Then they tested his blood sugar levels over the next few hours. So you can see that his blood sugar spiked up to 200 milligrams per deciliter. In other words, this patient qualified for a diagnosis of diabetes mellitus because of this glucose tolerance test, because of having eaten a high-fat diet, 80% fat by calorie, for just a week. Now look what happens when the same subject had eaten a high-carbohydrate diet, which was 80% carbohydrate by calorie, for a week. Again, the person fasted overnight, then got 50 grams of glucose in water, and look at how stable that person's blood sugar was. These are very good glucose numbers, whereas this suggested diabetes. So in other words, if you want to have good control of your glucose levels, you really should be eating a high-carbohydrate diet. Now this explains why it is that people with any form of diabetes tend to do better on a high-carbohydrate diet than on a low-carbohydrate diet. Fatty diets kill diabetics, and starchy diets save their lives. You can see the effect of the change in diet on the death rate from diabetes in England and Wales in the early 20th century by looking at this graph of the mortality index, which is the death rate from diabetes corrected for changes in the size of the population. And you can see that during times of peace and prosperity, such as the years before World War I, as the population got more and more access to fatty foods, the death rate from diabetes went up. Then, when the war came along and there was rationing, the death rate from diabetes dropped off sharply. Now here, what happens next is very interesting because you have 2 competing things going on. One is you got the periods of economic depression, and you also have the introduction of insulin. So here you have the death rate from diabetes starting to go up again because rationing had ended, but then you see the effects of the slump and the introduction of insulin, so you have a little bit of decrease here. But then as peace and prosperity return, as people get more access to fatty foods, then you have an increase in the death rate. Again, another slump, which means a recession or a depression, and it levels off again. As prosperity returns, death rate goes up, and then you have another war starts, rationing returns, death rate drops off sharply. Now, if you didn't understand what was going on in Britain at this time, if you didn't understand the relative number of people with type 1 or type 2 diabetes, and you didn't understand what insulin did and so forth, you would think that the introduction of insulin had no effect on the death rates due to diabetes in Britain. And that's an illusion created by the fact that insulin is really important only for people who have type 1 diabetes, which is also sometimes called insulin-dependent diabetes. If you have type 1 diabetes, it means that your pancreas is broken and it no longer makes enough insulin to keep you alive. In contrast, if you have type 2 diabetes, which is sometimes called non-insulin dependent diabetes, it means that your body is resisting the effects of insulin because it's trying to resist gaining more weight from your fatty diet. So since most people who have diabetes have type 2 diabetes, you can see that as the fat intake goes up during the times of peace and prosperity, the death rate from mainly type 2 diabetes goes up. As the fat consumption goes down, death rate goes down. Fat consumption goes up, death rate goes up. Fat consumption goes down, death rate goes down. You can see the relationship between carbohydrate intake and fat intake and the death rate from diabetes if you look at these data from World War II. Now you can see that the overall number of calories decreased but then somewhat recovered. So people were eating a little bit less in terms of their overall energy intake, their overall intake of calories. But what's interesting here is that their carbohydrate intake was going up, up, up. And their overall fat intake went down, down, down. And as their fat intake went down, look at what happened to the death rate. So these people who are telling you to eat more fat and less carb are ignoring these data from Britain. So here you see people shifting to a high carbohydrate diet, and look, they're getting plenty of protein. They're getting more protein than they were at the beginning. But they're also getting a lot more carbohydrate and a lot less fat, a lot fewer deaths. So the take-home message from this is more carb and less fat means fewer deaths from diabetes. The message couldn't be clearer. Calories are a measure of energy, and the bulk of the calories in the human diet come from 4 different classes of macronutrients. Now, they're called macronutrients because macro means big, and macronutrients are needed in relatively large amounts. So the 4 macronutrients in the human diet are carbohydrates, which consist of sugars and starches. When you digest a starch, the starch breaks down to release pure sugar. Fats, which are really triglycerides. A triglyceride is made up of 3 fatty acids and a glycerol molecule. Proteins, which are made up of 20 different amino acids, and alcohol, which is also called ethanol. Calories represent the energy that is captured from sunlight by the chlorophyll in green plants. So in this diagram you see the sunlight being captured by the chlorophyll, and it is being used to turn carbon dioxide and water into glucose and oxygen. So that's why green plants produce oxygen, and this process of photosynthesis yields glucose, which is a store of energy. We release this energy during metabolism. So when we digest glucose, when we metabolize glucose, we burn it by combining glucose plus oxygen to yield carbon dioxide and water, and this reaction that produces carbon dioxide and water from glucose and oxygen releases energy, which our cells can then use to do work. Plants can make fats and amino acids. Plants can make all of the fats and amino acids that are essential in the human diet. They can also make all of the vitamins except for vitamin B12, which comes from bacteria, and vitamin D, the sunshine vitamin. To get your supply of vitamin D, just go outside when it's sunny. Plants also contain minerals, which they absorb from the soil. All living cells contain carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. So in other words, all living cells contain 3 out of the 4 macronutrients, the other macronutrient being alcohol. Plant cells and animal cells have a lot in common with each other. However, plant cells differ from animal cells in ways that are important in nutrition. Every cell in every plant is surrounded by a hard capsule called a cell wall. The cell wall is made out of complex carbohydrates such as cellulose, hemicellulose, and pectin. These complex carbohydrates of cellulose, hemicellulose, and pectin are not digestible by human digestive enzymes. In other words, they're going to pass through your small intestine and into the large intestine without being digested. So any complex carbohydrate that can pass through your small intestine without being digested is called dietary fiber. Animal cells do not have a cell wall, and therefore animal source foods contain no dietary fiber whatsoever. Since every plant cell has a cell wall, the cell membrane, which is underneath that wall, doesn't have to be very tough. As a result, plant cells don't contain cholesterol. Instead, they contain other phytosterols that compete with cholesterol for absorption. So plant cells may contain a tiny smidgen of cholesterol, but if you eat a diet that's purely plant-based, your cholesterol intake for all intents and purposes is going to be practically zero. In contrast, animal cells don't have a cell wall, so their cell membrane has to be tough. That's why they contain cholesterol. So if you eat a lot of foods that come from animals, you will eat a lot of cholesterol. Plant cells have cell walls, so as a result, many of their structural elements within the plant are made out of fibers, such as cellulose. In contrast, animal cells do not have fiber, so they have to make their structural elements out of protein. So if you eat plants, you're going to get a lot of dietary fiber, whereas if you eat foods that come from animals, you're likely to get an overload of protein. Plants store their excess energy mainly in the form of starch, except in things like nuts and seeds. Starch is a pretty good way to store energy because it's non-reactive. However, it absorbs water, which makes it pretty heavy. So if you're a plant and you want to store energy in a tuber underground, such as a potato, it makes sense to store your energy in the form of starch. But if you want to pack a lot of energy into a portable form that's easy to carry around, you're probably going to want to add some of that energy in the form of fat. That's why nuts are so fatty and why some seeds are very fatty. Now, animals store most of their energy in the form of fat. They do have a little bit of energy stored in the form of glycogen, which is a starch, but that tends to break down after the animal is slaughtered. Animals, because they have to carry their energy stores around, want the lightest, most dense form of energy that they can possibly use for a fat storage, or for energy storage. So that's why they store their energy mainly as fat. The only animal source food that contains carbohydrate is milk, which contains the sugar called lactose, which many people cannot digest. Plant cells do contain protein, but the proteins that they contain are different from human proteins in 2 different ways. Number one, the overall balance of amino acids can be a little bit different. They can tend to contain less of the sulfur-containing amino acids. And also the order in which the amino acids are strung together is very different in a plant cell than it is in an animal cell, because plant's DNA is different from animal DNA. So if you eat plants, you're going to be eating proteins that are way different from the proteins in your own body. In contrast, if you eat proteins from other animals, and especially from other mammals, you're going to be eating protein that looks a lot like the proteins in your own body. And that's why eating animal source foods can promote autoimmune diseases, because the body will make antibodies to those proteins from your food that look kind of like your own body. Then those antibodies will cross-react with your own tissue. So that's why a diet heavily based on animal source foods tends to promote autoimmune diseases such as inflammatory arthritis or lupus or type 1 diabetes. Plant cells contain certain kinds of nutrients that are never found in animals. Because they're found in plants, they're called phytonutrients. So plant cells contain phytonutrients, and animal cells never contain phytonutrients. Plant cells never contain vitamin B12, and animal cells contain vitamin B12. All of the vitamin B12 in the universe, or at least on Earth, is made by bacteria. Plants have no need for vitamin B12 because vitamin B12 is important for the nerves and the red blood cells. Since plants have no nerves and they have no blood, they have no need for vitamin B12. In contrast, animals do have blood and animals do have nerves, and as a result they need vitamin B12. Most animals get vitamin B12 from the bacteria in their own intestines. Some animals get their vitamin B12 from eating other animals. Human beings need some vitamin B12, and they need more than they can get from the bacteria in their own intestines, or more than they can reliably get from the bacteria in their own intestines. I think that a lot of people in olden days who were eating a very heavily plant-based diet were getting a lot more bacteria in their diet because of lower standards of hygiene than we currently have. So if you're eating a purely plant-based diet nowadays, you should be taking a vitamin B12 supplement, especially if you're going vegan for any length of time or if you're pregnant. Many people are interested in what has been called the paleo diet. The idea is that we should be eating the kind of diet that sustained our ancestors during the Paleolithic era, or the early Stone Age, which was the time before we started farming. So this meant that there were no cultivated grains and there were no dairy products. So according to the paleo theory, we should be eating a diet based heavily on meats plus some vegetables. So the paleo diet is basically the Atkins diet with a salad. However, if we look at actual results of studies of human remains and so forth, we find that even Neanderthals were eating a lot of starchy foods because the starch grains have been preserved in the tartar on their teeth. So I think it's far better to base your nutrition decisions on studies of the health effects of actual diets in modern populations. That being said, there were two basic kinds of diet that were common in the era before the Industrial Revolution. Most people in most places throughout the world ate a diet that was heavily based on plants. This kind of diet was high in fiber, high in carbohydrates, especially starch, and low in fat. It was mainly based on some sort of starchy staple such as rice or corn or wheat or potatoes or sweet potatoes or cassava or something like that, plus vegetables. This was the diet that sustained the peasants in just about every population, whereas the wealthy people were the ones who were eating a lot of meats, and they were the ones who were eating a lot of expensive things like a lot of honey and so forth. So most people were eating basically potatoes and vegetables or bread and vegetables and so forth, whereas the rich people were eating a lot of meats and cheeses and so forth. Now the other kind of diet that was eaten by pre-industrial people tended to be very heavily animal-based. This was the kind of diet that was eaten by people who were nomadic herding people, such as the modern Maasai, or the people who lived in the high Arctic, such as the Inuit, who used to be called the Eskimo. Their diets tend to be very low in fiber, very low in carbohydrates, and very high in fat. Now, a lot of people offer the Inuit and the Maasai as examples of the diet that we should follow, but I disagree with that for the very simple reason that both of those groups have extremely low life expectancies by modern standards. High-carb, high-fiber diets promote health and long life. The blue zone populations are the populations with unusually long lifespans, and these populations tend to eat a very low-fat, very high-carbohydrate diet. They include the people of Okinawa, Japan, the Seventh-day Adventists in the United States, and the residents of Ikaria in Greece. In contrast, the Inuit and the Maasai, who are the models of the low-carb paleo-type diet, have extremely short lifespans. Do you want a long life or a short life? The Okinawan diet consists of starchy vegetables, some rice, other vegetables, maybe some soy products, very, very little fish, practically no animal proteins, very, very little animal fat, no dairy products. In contrast, the Inuit eat a diet that's very heavily based on fish and on mammals that eat fish. So their diet is extremely high in fat. They eat very, very little in the way of plant food, especially in the winter. Now, a lot of people in the paleo movement claim that the Inuit are immune to heart attacks, and that's false. The Inuit diet is high in fat, especially omega-3 fatty acids. The Inuit do have atherosclerosis, but they don't have quite as many heart attacks as you might expect. The high omega-3 fatty acid content of their diet acts as a blood thinner, like taking an aspirin a day. The blood thinning effect of this high omega-3 fatty acid intake prevents some heart attacks, but it also increases the risk of death from bleeding. So the Inuit might not have as many heart attacks as you might expect, but they can die of a nosebleed. The Inuit also have shockingly high rates of osteoporosis. Again, do you want to live a long life or a short life? Seventh-day Adventists in the United States have a remarkably long lifespan because most of them are vegetarians and a lot of them are vegans. Their diet tends to be based heavily on plant-based foods. In contrast, the diet of the Maasai in Kenya is based almost exclusively on the meat, milk, and blood of their animals. So the Seventh-day Adventists live a long time, the Maasai have a short life expectancy. The Maasai do get atherosclerosis. However, they get so much exercise that their coronary arteries expand to compensate for the clogging. The diet that many people in industrialized countries are now eating includes lots of meats, dairy foods, eggs, and fish. It also includes a lot of refined plant foods, foods that contain little or no fiber, and that contain concentrated fats and concentrated sugars. This is the kind of rich, fatty diet that used to be available only to the very rich back in the olden days. As a result, diseases that used to be diseases of the rich back in the olden days are now occurring among working class people. This rich, fatty diet promotes obesity, heart disease, diabetes, cancer, and autoimmune disease. Nothing in nature is both high fat and high sugar at the same time. Honey is a high sugar food, but it contains no fat. There are lots of sugary fruits, but none of them are also high in fat. Nuts contain fat, but they contain practically no sugar. Many junk foods represent a 50-50 mix of concentrated fat and concentrated sugar. These unnaturally delicious foods are the most fattening foods known to humankind. Because they are so delicious, they tempt us to eat far more than we need. You would not be tempted to overeat pure sugar, nor would you be tempted to overeat pure fat. But if you mix the two together, it's very easy to overeat. That's why we have no natural defense against cheesecake. The promoters of low-carbohydrate diets often claim that there are essential fats, but there are no essential carbohydrates, so therefore your diet should be mainly fat. Now this is total nonsense, and anybody who's read even an introductory level textbook on nutrition should know better than to make this kind of argument. An essential nutrient is a nutrient that must come ready-made in the diet. For example, cats can make their own supply of vitamin C, but human beings cannot. So vitamin C is essential for human beings, but not for cats. The fact that a nutrient is essential does not mean that you need a lot of it. Vitamin C, for example, is a micronutrient, which means that you only need a tiny amount of it in your diet. So the fact that something is essential means that you need to have some of it in your diet, but it doesn't necessarily mean you need a lot of it. There are some essential fats, essential fatty acids, but your need for those essential fatty acids is so small that it wasn't discovered until people were being fed nothing but glucose solutions intravenously. And even then, the patient's need for these essential fatty acids could be met by rubbing a little bit of vegetable oil on their skin. A lot of the people who promote low carbohydrate diets claim that you don't need to eat carbohydrates because carbohydrates are not essential in the diet. But carbohydrates are not essential in the diet because you can make sugar out of protein. So even if you were eating no carbohydrate at all, your liver would be able to make enough glucose out of protein in order to keep your blood sugar from dropping too low. So protein is broken down into amino acids. Many of the amino acids are broken down into a carbon skeleton plus ammonia and maybe some sulfuric acid. That carbon skeleton from the amino acid can be converted into sugar, and that's where the blood sugar comes from in people who are eating no-carb diets. Your body can make glucose out of protein because it can turn amino acids from protein into glucose. However, when it breaks down those amino acids to turn them into glucose, it releases ammonia and sulfuric acid. These waste products explain why it is that people who are on high-protein diets are likely to have problems with their kidneys and their liver and their bones. The sulfuric acid, in particular, is probably the reason why people who have very high-protein diets are at high risk for osteoporosis. Don't worry about getting enough protein. Human protein needs are actually small because human beings grow so slowly. Plants contain protein, and ordinary plant-based foods provide enough protein to meet human protein needs. In fact, it's practically impossible even to design a plant-based diet that would be deficient in protein if the person eats enough food to get enough calories. If you take care of the calories, the protein takes care of itself. On the other hand, if you're not getting enough food to get enough calories, your body will convert protein into sugar to burn it for fuel. There are 8 amino acids that are essential for human adults. They include phenylalanine, valine, threonine, tryptophan, methionine, leucine, isoleucine, and lysine. Babies also need a supply of histidine in their food because they cannot make histidine fast enough. Any practical plant-based diet will provide enough of all of these amino acids for a human adult, even for a pregnant woman, as long as the person is eating enough food to get enough calories. If you want to be able to tell who's telling you the truth about nutrition, you need to know some basic lessons about biochemistry. Let's start with carbohydrates. Carbohydrates were called carbohydrates because they're based on simple sugars, and each simple sugar contains the equivalent of 1 molecule of water for each atom of carbon. So in other words, they are hydrated carbons. So if you see in this molecule of glucose here, you see the equivalent of 1 molecule of water, here are these oxygen and 2 hydrogens, for each atom of carbon. So if you take 2 molecules of simple sugar, which are called monosaccharides, which means 1 sugar, if you take 2 monosaccharides and bind them together, you end up with a disaccharide, which means a 2 sugar molecule. So the sugar that you find in your sugar bowl is a disaccharide called sucrose, which consists of glucose and fructose. Fructose is also found in fruits such as apples. So the carbohydrates, since they are hydrated carbons, already contain a lot of oxygen. So in other words, it's going to take a lot less oxidation or burning to turn them into carbon dioxide and water than it would take to turn fat into carbon dioxide and water. So down here you see a molecule of a fatty acid called oleic acid, which is commonly found in olive oil. Now notice you see lots of carbons and lots of hydrogens, but hardly any oxygen. So in other words, Fats are mainly hydrocarbons as opposed to carbohydrates. Because the fats contain less oxygen, that means more calories per pound. Here's the skinny on fats. The fats in our diet are triglycerides. Each triglyceride is a molecule that is made up of 3 molecules of fatty acid bound to a molecule of glycerol. The fats differ from each other according to which fatty acids they contain. All fatty acids are basically carboxylic acid. If you have ever gotten soap in your eye, you have felt the sting of a fatty acid. That sting comes from the carboxylic acid group. A carboxylic acid consists of a carbon atom plus this oxygen with a double bond, oxygen with a single bond, and a hydrogen. The simplest carboxylic acid is formic acid, which is a very powerful acid that's found in the venom of an ant. The next most powerful fatty acid is acetic acid, which gives the bite to vinegar. It has 2 carbons. Now, as the length of the carbon chain increases, the fatty acid gets more fatty, but less acid. So as the shorter the fatty acid chain gets, the less fatty and more acid it gets. So these simplest fatty acids here are very soluble in water. Formic acid is very soluble in water. Acetic acid is in vinegar. It's very soluble in water. Even butyric acid, which is a little bit oily, but it still mixes easily with water. But as the carbon chain of the fatty acids gets longer, the fatty acid gets more fatty and relatively less acid. Of course, the number of carbon atoms is not the only thing that matters. In this diagram, I show 4 different fatty acids, each of which has 18 carbon atoms. But each one has its own set of properties because of the different number of hydrogen atoms and the different positions of the double bonds. The top one, stearic acid, is an example of a saturated fat because each of the bonds between the carbons is a single bond, which means that this fatty acid has as much hydrogen as it can possibly hold. That's why it's called saturated, because it's got as much hydrogen as it can possibly hold. Oleic acid, in contrast, is a monounsaturated fatty acid because there's 1 double bond. And here's that 1 double bond. This double bond is in the omega-9 position. This is the omega carbon. Now, omega is the last letter of the Greek alphabet, so the omega carbon is the last carbon in the carbon chain. So this is the omega-1 position, omega-2, omega-3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So you have 1 double bond at the omega-9 position in oleic acid. Now, stearic acid is solid at room temperature, but oleic acid, which is common in olive oil, is liquid at room temperature because of this double bond. Polyunsaturated fats contain more than 1 double bond. This example, linoleic acid, which is one of the 2 essential amino acids, contains 2 double bonds, one at the omega-6 position and one at the omega-9 position. Alpha-linolenic acid is an omega-3 fatty acid, which means that its first double bond is at the omega-3 position. Omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids are essential in the human diet. In particular, linoleic acid and alpha-linolenic acid are the essential fatty acids in human nutrition. You need to get a tiny amount of linoleic acid and alpha-linolenic acid from your food because your body needs these in ready-made form because it uses them as ingredients to make important signaling chemicals within your immune system. Now, if you have too much omega-6 relative to the amount of omega-3 that you have, you will end up with an imbalance in your immune system. So you will tend to be in a more pro-inflammatory state. So if you eat too much vegetable oil from seeds and so forth, then you will tend to get too much omega-6 fatty acid relative to the amount of omega-3 fatty acid that you eat. So in order to get enough omega-3 fatty acid to balance that out, you should eat a lot of leafy green vegetables, and if you have any doubt, add a little bit of flaxseed to your cereal in the morning, or maybe eat a walnut or two, because they're rich sources of omega-3 fatty acids. Now, the human body can convert alpha-linolenic acid into the other omega-3 fatty acids that are important in the body. So you don't need any saturated fat, you don't need any monounsaturated fat, you need tiny amounts of these two polyunsaturated fats, linoleic acid and alpha-linolenic acid. By looking at these diagrams, you can see why it is that the number and positions of the double bonds in the carbon chain make a difference. Here's stearic acid. See, it's straight. But look, oleic acid has a kink in it, which is the result of that double bond, which is right here at the omega-9 position. In contrast, look, here's linoleic acid has 2 kinks in it, and alpha-linolenic acid has 3 kinks in it. So the reason that stearic acid has a higher melting point than these other things is because the stearic acid molecule is easily packed into a crystalline form, whereas these other things don't like to pack as well into a crystalline form, so they remain liquid at room temperature, whereas stearic acid is solid at room temperature. Vegetable oils are liquid at room temperature because they contain a lot of polyunsaturated fatty acids. Now, what if you wanted to take a product like corn oil and turn it into a fat that stays solid at room temperature? In other words, how do you turn a vegetable oil into shortening? To do that, you hydrogenate it. In other words, you add hydrogen. Now, to help this reaction along, you use the metal called nickel. Now, this is a coin called a nickel, but it contains a metal called nickel. The nickel is not included in the final product, but it helps the reaction along, so it's called a catalyst. So you want to start off with this linoleic acid and end up with stearic acid, but you might accidentally produce some incompletely hydrogenated product that has one double bond, but notice here that the hydrogens are on opposite sides of the double bond. This is called a trans configuration. In a cis configuration, both of those hydrogens would be on the same side. The trans fatty acids are very thermodynamically stable, so they are not found in large amounts in nature, and your body's not really good at dealing with them. So the trans fats that you find in hydrogenated foods are a big contributor to atherosclerosis. Now, as I said, a triglyceride consists of three molecules of fatty acid. Here's three stearic acids combined with one molecule of glycerol. Now, if you've ever gotten soap in your eye, you have felt the sting of the carboxylic acid group of a fatty acid. In a triglyceride, that stinging part is bound up to the glycerol. So that's why oils are not irritating, whereas individual fatty acids, free fatty acids, can be very irritating. And here's a triglyceride, a better idea of how it would look in reality. And you can see that this you end up with some kinks from the double bonds here and there. I've explained some complicated chemistry in this video, but I want to give you some simple take-home messages. First is that the human body was built to run on a high-fiber, high-carbohydrate, plant-based diet. That diet is based on starchy foods, such as grains, including wheat, rye, barley, rice, corn, teff, and things like that. And vegetables, including starchy vegetables, such as potatoes, sweet potatoes, cassava, and so forth, but also including some non-starchy vegetables, such as lettuce and carrots and broccoli and all that. It also includes fruits, as well as legumes, and legumes are beans and peas. The only supplement that people who are eating a purely plant-based or vegan diet need is vitamin B12. Vitamin B12 is made by bacteria, and it is essential in the human diet. If you do not get enough vitamin B12 in your diet, you will end up with a condition called pernicious anemia, and it was called pernicious because it was fatal. So if you are eating a purely plant-based diet for any length of time, and especially if you are pregnant, please take a supplement of vitamin B12. The only other vitamin that is not present in plant-based foods is vitamin D. You can get your supply of vitamin D by going outside in the sunshine. You can survive on a low-fiber, low-carb, paleo-type diet for years, but you will likely have a short lifespan. Again, do you want to live a long life on a plant-based diet or a short life on a paleo-type diet? For more information about sugar metabolism and fat metabolism, see my book, Thin Diabetes, Fat Diabetes, Prevent Type 1 and Cure Type 2. Also, check out my website, thindiabetes.com.